In 1927, a gruesome civil war broke out in China, and it raged on for over 20 years. During this period of time, 4 perspectives fought for power. The first one to be defeated was that of the Japanese Empire, who were trying to conquer China amidst the chaos of the war. The second was the declining Qing dynasty. It had ruled China for over 300 years, but cyclical famines and an oppressive landlord system had kept the large masses of China impoverished and politically disenfranchised. The poor masses were now rising up and being led by the third perspective, weighed out in the Civil War. A class of China's young intellectuals who had taken inspiration from the sentiments of equality and sustainability expressed by European socialists, the same sentiments that had led to the success of the recent Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. But the fourth perspective was not a political group or an army. It was that of a single remarkable woman named Jiang Qing. And Jiang Qing was entirely different from everyone around her during the midst of the revolution. She believed in nothing except the power of her will to shape her own reality. And while the struggle for power in China waged on, Jiang Qing moved to Shanghai to pursue her dream of becoming a famous actress. Not long after arriving in Shanghai, she married a famous writer called Tang Na. But not too long after that, she divorced him because she had come to believe that Tang Na was something that she could not possibly tolerate, a weak man. After she left him, Tang Na was devastated and tried to commit suicide by jumping into a river. But he survived.
She married a quite famous writer called Tang Na, and after marriage, she doesn't feel very satisfied about her husband, because her husband is not a very, very strong man, and she left him, and he jumped to the river, and then the water was very cold, so he jumped up again, you see.
And after his suicide attempt, Jiang Qing wrote a letter to him, explaining to him that he ought to not take her decision entirely as a reflection of himself, but rather evidence of Jiang Qing's uncompromising way of being. The letter explained that powerful forces persisted inside her, and that these forces were driving her towards fame and power. The letter went on and on about how these forces were the only realizations that kept Jiang Qing sane, before ending the letter with, "Nothing must hold me back. All that matters is that you remember me as a woman who never caves in before anyone and who will never bear to be treated as inferior to men." Jiang Qing envisioned a life for herself in which she would become the greatest actress in Shanghai, and eventually, the world. But her vision of fame and influence played out only in her head, as she would encounter failure after failure. The men who ran the studios in Shanghai found her ambition to be distasteful and her temperament difficult. Her most famous part was that of a supporting actress in a film called Bloodshed on Wolf Mountain, where she was casted under Shanghai's up-and-coming star, Li Lily. A A delusional Zhang Qi convinced herself that Li was constantly trying to upstage her in order to sabotage her career out of jealousy. She grew more and more frustrated until eventually, she believed that the only way to unlock her full potential would be to escape the oppressive Shanghai establishment that was holding her back. So she did what all the other young, stubborn, and frustrated people in China did at the time, and she headed for Yan'an to join the revolution. Yan'an at the time was the headquarters of the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, which had been leading the revolution against the Qing dynasty. The environment in Yan'an was charged with revolutionary zeal, attracting intellectuals, artists, and young idealists from all over China who wanted to be part of this new movement that was promising radical change. In Yan'an, the revolutionaries had established liberal social norms that contrasted with traditional Chinese society. Their way of living was more relaxed, open, and at times experimental, compared to the rest of China, where traditional values and Confucian ethics still shaped the majority of social interactions. One example of how this took shape was sex. The revolutionaries were having lots of sex. They even referred to it as undisciplined guerrilla warfare. Well, this undisciplined guerrilla warfare sex was widely celebrated amongst the community, and that is how Zhang Qing met her husband, Mao Zedong. Mao was already married when his relationship with Zhang Qing began. This made for quite the controversy, as Mao was not just another one of the revolutionaries, he was the leader of the CCP and the central figure of the Chinese Revolution. In 1939, Mao decided that he was going to divorce his wife at the time and marry Zhang Qing. This disgusted the other high-ranking revolutionaries who had supported Mao, as this was seen as both a break from traditional Chinese norms and the perceived collective ethos of the communist movement. Mao, however, did not waver in his decision, and so the backlash of the controversy was redirected towards Zhang Qing, who was now being scorned by the other revolutionaries as a social climbing parasite. The other revolutionaries began to view Zhang Qing as a dangerous, destructive force because she was driven by a fierce and radical individualism that threatened the collective dream that the communists had been building in Yan'an. Under the communist structure, everyone was part of a unit, but Zhang Qing infamously insisted, "I am a unit of one." Zhang Qing had become a problem that the revolutionists couldn't solve, and in a desperate attempt for a solution, they visited Joseph Stalin in Moscow to ask for his advice. Stalin advised not to interfere with their marriage, but to instead require Zhang Qing to sign an explicit agreement that she would refrain from any form of politics for 30 years. Mao found this fitting, as he fully intended to ensure his party members that Zhang Qing could in fact be trusted, and so with no way out, she reluctantly signed the agreement. But inside, she was furious to be controlled by these men, furious to have thoughts and opinions constrained, furious to find herself silenced by revolutionists who in her eyes were not as radical, as visionary, or as willing to die for their beliefs as she. This fury would only grow as the revolutionists then tracked down and destroyed all of her old films. They did this because the roles that she played the way she appeared on the screen, the words coming out of her mouth, none of this fit the image of Mao's wife the CCP wanted to put forward. Her fury grew. Jiang Qing wanted power on her own behalf as an individual, and now she also wanted revenge. After China's Civil War, the CCP took power. This marked the birth of the People's Republic of China. Although the war was over, an unprecedented number of people were now about to die. China's new leader, Mao Zedong, enacted a campaign known as the Great Leap Forward. In an attempt to transform China from an agrarian economy into an industrialized one, Mao would decrease efforts to scale China's grain yields and instead focused on spreading industries historically concentrated in China's urban areas out into the countryside. While Mao took focus and assets away from China's agricultural contributors, he also established high agricultural quotas. These quotas were so ambitious that they were effectively delusional. But because local officials were too fearful of being viewed as rightists or in opposition to the Communist Party, they reported that their quotas were not only being met, but often overachieved. Non-existent surpluses were being reported back to China's capital, while in reality, farmers themselves were beginning to starve to death. Officials did not dare to report the economic disaster unfolding and instead began blaming bad weather for the decline in food output. No action was taken, and as many as 55 million people died in what is likely the largest famine in human history. During all of this, Jiang Qing was living alone, surrounded only by her pet monkeys and her nurses, whom she hated because she was convinced they were conspiring against her. The nurses, that is, not the monkeys. The leaders of the Communist Party were turning Jiang Qing into an outcast. They felt that her ideas were too dangerous to be anywhere near her husband or any kind of power. For years now, the powerful urges inside her that had been motivating her to chase greatness were being suppressed by the men around her, and Jiang Qing was literally starting to go mad. The leaders in the Communist Party pounced on this opportunity to separate Mao from his wife and argued that Zhen's mental state undermined Mao's authority. Jiang Qing was now going to be sent to Moscow to be locked in a mental infirmary. Although Jiang Qing thought she had lost control of her life, it was now her husband's life that was in danger. Mao's policies were a disaster, as made evident from the sheer scale of the famines. The other communist leaders now wanted to get rid of Mao, and he knew this. Without having anyone to trust, he sent for his wife. Jiang Qing was brought to Mount Lushan in secret to meet Mao Zedong, where he was confronting the other revolutionaries. Jiang Qing understood that her association with Mao was the only thing that she had left in life to leverage, and she was determined to stop them from overthrowing her husband. Several of the men that they were now plotting against were the same men who had forced Jiang Qing to sign away her freedoms, the same men who had isolated her in Moscow. And Jiang Qing passionately hated all of them. Jiang Qing was now convinced that these men weren't really revolutionaries, but actually, they were posers. She viewed them as ghosts from the past who claimed to be ushering in a new era for China, but in reality were consumed by thoughts and perspectives of the past, thoughts similar to the decaying, corrupt empire that had ruled China for the last 300 years. So while Mao was buying time in Mount Lushan, appeasing the other revolutionaries, he told Jiang Qing to go to Shanghai and quietly start preparing for a new kind of revolution, one that none of their opposition would see coming. Jiang Qing was now making a return to the start of her story, the Shanghai studios. But unlike her time as an actress, she was now in control. China's next revolution was going to be driven by her self-expression, the same self-expression that the studio producers had tried to stifle over 20 years ago. Mao made his wife in charge of the arts, propaganda, and culture in China. Her infamous Unit of One was now going to take over the revolution and reshape the minds of Chinese people across the country. While the revolutionaries, like the studio directors, found Jiang Qing to be impossibly difficult because they sought to control her, to the average person, Jiang Qing was charming and worth admiring. Her charm stemmed from the fact that she appeared to do and say whatever she liked in a society where most people only said what they were expected to say, or that which was politically correct for the times. Jiang Qing began taking old Chinese operas and reworking them so that they became more dramatic melodramas about the need to struggle against the evil forces still hidden in Chinese society. Hate was a key word in the scripts. It must be shouted, she said, as if it was a grenade that you were hurling at the enemy. She casted female stars and told them it was imperative to communicate to the audience that beauty is less important than will and power. Jiang Qing's plan was to turn the whole of China into one of her melodramas and provoke millions of people until an intense frenzy of individualism would break out, undermining the influence of her revolutionary rivals. She was going to shatter existing cultural perceptions and usher in a new brand, a new society. But before that, she was going to seek out petty revenge against the Shanghai film industry, because she was still convinced that the elites of China's film industry had it out for her. As she was governing over China's culture and propaganda, she could decide what films, what stars, and what production houses were in line and out of line with the new communist ideology. Jiang Qi used this as an opportunity to seek revenge on anyone she felt who had wronged her. The lucky studio heads, directors, and journalists were simply fired, while the unlucky ones were beaten. But the worst punishment was saved for Jiang Qi's arch-nemesis, the film star, Li Lili. Because Jiang Qi felt so strongly that Li Lili had upstaged her all those years ago, she had Li Lili and her husband seized and tortured. Li Lili survived, but her husband couldn't bear it, and he committed suicide. In 1966, China was sealed off from the rest of the world, and no one knew much about what was really happening there. One day, a group of engineers monitoring Chinese television signals in the mountains of Hong Kong noticed something unusual happening in Beijing. They noticed what appeared like hundreds of thousands of people streaming in from other cities in the countryside. On August 11th, in 1966, 1.5 million people, most of whom were students and school children, assembled in Tiananmen Square. The massive crowd passionately cried out chants until their leader, Mao Zedong, appeared on the balcony above them. Mao Zedong and his wife, Jiang, had successfully unleashed a new force amongst China's younger generation. Mao called them the little devils of youth. He told them that they were going to save the revolution and that their job was to go and seek out the demons and the monsters who were corrupting the revolution's progress. No one should be safe, he said. They should all be torn down and smashed to a pulp. And then the new revolutionaries gave themselves a name, the Red Guards. Jiang Qin had curated the aggression that made this crowd so dangerous, and because of that, she felt incredibly powerful. She now saw herself as equal to Mao. Despite her progress, Jiang Qin was convinced that the threat, like the lifeline of the revolution, came from inside people's minds. She knew that even though China had gone through a revolution, little had actually changed inside the heads of millions of the people, including those in power. They still believed in a rigid hierarchy, and she felt that despite her newfound power, the other leaders of the communist parties scorned her for being a woman. If they could, they would do anything to stop her. And so to continue undermining their influence, Jiang Qin continued to rewrite old Chinese operas into epic melodramas about the need to challenge and destroy the old order. All the old characters of classic productions who had any authority within their plots were banished. Instead, the ordinary people and women took center stage as the protagonists, authority figures, and the powerful. These operas were performed to millions of young guards, and in talks before the performances, Jiang Qin told the audience how they were about to watch heroes awakening to a realization that they could take control of their own life and take control of their own destiny. These messages resonated intensely with the public, and China's youth was bursting at the seams. And so Mao and Jiang Qin let them loose. They suspended all schools and universities, releasing 120 million students who were now devoted to finding and destroying the demons that were hiding amongst the old authority. Teachers of these students were paraded through the streets and made to chant, "I'm a demon, I'm a devil, and I deserve to die." Those who didn't sing would be beaten with belts and sticks. High-up members of the Communist Party were seized and paraded in front of tens of thousands of screaming people and forced to confess to thought crimes against the revolution. If they didn't, they were beaten and killed. Jiang Qin was now the most powerful woman in the world. She was in charge of giant cohorts of Red Guards that she guided, and she told who to attack and destroy. But what everyone, except her, was beginning to realize was that Jiang Qin had lost control. This cultural revolution had nothing to do with China's politics, economics, or way of life. Jiang Qin had done nothing to really change the structure of power in China. All she and Mao had accomplished was unleashing an unprecedented wave of anger and resentment in China. Mass killings broke out in Beijing, and hundreds of people in Shanghai who feared being targeted by the Red Guards began committing suicide. But Jiang Qin had become famous in the West. A feminist writer from America called Roxanne Whitkey came to Beijing to interview her, excited to meet who was perhaps the most influential woman in the world. But as she talked to Jiang Qin, Whitkey quickly became disappointed and realized things were not as they seemed. In fact, things were not even as Jiang Qin understood them. rather than bring about change, rather than stand for something, rather than curating a better future for China, Jiang Qing was simply using her new power to avenge herself and attack all of the people that she felt had wronged her throughout her life. The chaos pursuing in China almost boiled over into its own kind of civil war. Different groups of armed Red Guards were now fighting each other in all of the major cities. But Jiang Qing still foolishly believed that real power was almost within her grasp. She had just used the Red Guard to destroy the one man who was seen as Mao's successor, Li Yao Shaoqi. Red Guards abducted Li, beat him, and imprisoned him before everyone, including children, labeled the fallen revolutionary as one of the last demons. And then, all of a sudden, Mao turned on Jiang Qing. At a public meeting of those in charge of the Cultural Revolution, he told her, "You are someone who has grandiose aims, but puny abilities, great ambition, but little talent." It was in that moment Jiang Qing realized that she was being used. Jiang Qing thought she had been building the future, but actually, through her operas, she was simply remixing the past, and in doing so, she had reawakened a dark and poisonous violence that lurked under the surface of China for hundreds of years. It was driven by a resentment of the rigid hierarchies that her revolution had up until then did nothing to really change. It was only now becoming clear to her, in light of her husband's abrupt betrayal, that she had never had control over the millions of people she was influencing, and that the reason Mao had not cared up until that point is because this was all part of his plan. Mao had no idea how to bring about true change in China. All he knew was that those around him were conspiring against him, and so he used Jiang Qing and the rage he knew existed inside of her to summon up inner frustrations of millions of people into an unprecedented rage. Rage that would be used to eliminate all of Mao's political rivals. Mao would remain unchallenged and in power until his death. And Jiang Qing had been betrayed yet again, but she stayed with Mao because by that point, she had no choice. And then 1 month after Mao's death, she was arrested. She spent the rest of her life in jail, where her health worsened considerably until eventually she took her own life.